Okay, so what are the propositions so far? You inhabit a structure that orients you in the world. It has something that's akin to a narrative structure. I'm here, I'm going there, and this is the way I did it. It's narrative if you describe it. It's based in biological necessity, but it's shaped by socialization, and the fact of that base and that shaping means that the set of interpretive schema that you can lay out in the world are bounded. Those would be functional, hypothetically functional systems, and maybe they compete over the evolutionary time span, but there's something in common across that set of functional interpretations, and if you extract that out you can get the initial images of what you might describe as an archetypally universal morality. That's what archetypes are, fundamentally. So, and to say all that is no more than to say that people can abstract across instances, and we can obviously do that. So then the question is, can you start to develop an articulated picture of what that archetypal structure of universal morality might be? And so my answer to that was basically, well, let's look at old stories, as many old stories as we can collect, and if the stories are stories that have survived for a very long period of time, so much the better, because that indicates that they're peculiarly memorable and peculiarly functional, because if they weren't memorable then they'd have been forgotten, and if they weren't functional they wouldn't have managed to be the foundation stories for cultures that lasted for thousands or even tens of thousands of years. So, and then we could say, well, let's collect a whole variety of these stories and see if there's patterns across them. Now the danger of that is, have you collected an unbiased set of stories? Danger number one. How do you know that you're not just reading into the stories? That's the postmodern problem. Reasonable objections. And so those objections have been laid against people like he wrote The Golden Bough, Fraser, who was one of the first anthropologists to collect stories from all over the world and to start to look for commonalities. The same objection has been laid at the feet of people like Mircea Eliade or Carl Jung or Joseph Campbell. It's like, how do you know you're not just cherry picking your damn interpretations? Perfectly reasonable objection. And I would say that the reason I don't believe that I'm cherry picking my interpretations is because I used a method, and it's a method that's akin to the multi-trait, multi-method method of construct validation that clinical psychology and other disciplines of psychology rely upon, but that's also akin to a process put forward by E.O. Wilson that he called consilience. And the process is something like, well, pick your level of analysis. Does the phenomena manifest itself at that level of analysis? Yes. Pick another level of analysis and another level of analysis and another level of analysis, and see if the same phenomena manifests itself at every single level, and then assume that the probability that that will happen by chance decreases with each additional level of analysis that fits where there's concordance. And I thought, okay, that makes sense. So it isn't only that you can look for patterns in stories, because, you know, what if you're a hyperactive pattern detector, which basically means, like, and there are people like that, people who tilt towards paranoia, people who tilt towards conspiracy theories. You can see it manifest itself in New Age thinking all the time, because New Age thinkers are very high in openness but not very good at critical thinking, and so they see phenomena A and B and C and D, they think pattern, and then they think universal pattern, but they don't attempt to disconfirm their pattern prediction. And so what I tried to do when I was starting to see patterns emerge in the stories, informed by people like Jung and Eliade and so forth, was to see if what they were describing manifested itself at any other levels of analysis that were independent intellectually from that stream of thinking. And I found it in two places. I found it in cybernetics, and I found it in neuroscience. And so, and the neuroscience element, that includes the physiology, but also the behavioral analysis that was done by people, most particularly like Jeffrey Gray and the animal experimentalists, who were brilliant scientists and who've done a very good job of laying out the manner in which interpretive frameworks exist within the realm of animal cognition and to describe how they manifest themselves in the world. So I thought, okay, that's not too bad. We've got maybe 4 different levels of evidence all pointing in the same direction. And so that's why I walked you guys through the neuropsychology. It's like, A story is you're going somewhere, you're somewhere and you're going somewhere, and you're tracking your progress. Okay, that's the story. Well, what happens when you look at how people lay out, they're called cognitive maps. Well, it's the same thing. You specify a target, an end point, you specify a beginning point, which is just where you are, and then there's a mechanism, a comparator mechanism that operates, or multiple comparator mechanisms that operate neurophysiologically to orient yourself towards that goal, and the emotions basically emerge as a consequence of that. Positive emotions indicating that you're moving forward properly, negative emotions indicating that you've encountered some kind of obstacle. It's like, well, that's the basic structure of a narrative. Okay, fine. So now we can see how it's instantiated neurophysiologically. That adds a fair bit of credence to the entire process. So now normally when you look at the basic cybernetic work, there's a hypothesis that the system is oriented towards a goal, and that it's comparing what is manifesting itself in the world to that desired end state as the system moves. But it's too simple, because people don't precisely have goals. They have nested hierarchies of goals. And so the issue of emotional regulation becomes more complex than, are you proceeding happily towards your current goal? Because your goal is composed of micro goals, and it's a constituent element of a set of macro goals. And so that makes the problem of error far more complex than it would be if you only had one frame of reference and you were only adjudicating your error within that frame of reference. The question starts to become, what does it mean when you make a mistake? And the answer to that, the behavioral answer to that was, well, you encounter a stimuli that's a threat, or maybe a punishment, or an incentive reward, or a consummatory reward, something like that. It's a unidimensional and oversimplified answer. I'm not complaining about it. It has great utility. But there's a problem, and the problem is it doesn't take into account the nested structure of your goal hierarchy. And what that means is that it underestimates the difficulty of responding to an error. Because the problem with an error is that you don't know what the error signifies. And that's a huge problem. And that's part of what I want to delve into even in more depth today. And so this is like Alice in Wonderland going down the rabbit hole. It's exactly the same thing. That's the rabbit hole is, you made a mistake, right? You made a mistake. You've got your oversimplified representation of the world laid upon it. It validates itself in its execution if it executes properly. If it executes improperly, then what does that signify? And the answer isn't precisely that you've made a mistake. The answer is, it signifies that there's something in the world that you excluded that shouldn't have been excluded. And that's a big problem, because when you've laid out a simplified schema on the world, you've excluded virtually everything. And so what that means is that as soon as you make an error, the search space for the error immediately tends towards the infinite. And you experience that. It's part of human existential experience. And the way you experience that is, especially if your mood is shaky, is you lay out a small plan, like maybe you go out for coffee with someone that you're romantically interested in, and they're not pleasant to you. And so that's an error. It means, well, what does it mean? Well, you've construed yourself wrong, you've construed them wrong, you've construed the opposite sex wrong, you've construed human beings wrong, you're a walking catastrophe, and you might as well not even exist. It's like, well, that's pretty extreme, but it's not that extreme, I'll tell you. Like, it's not that uncommon for people to have exactly that set of catastrophic responses to even a minor setback. Now, it's not good for them, and I would say, you know, just because you scraped your foot doesn't mean you should dig a grave and jump into it and pull the dirt on top of you, you know. So you don't want to start by taking yourself completely apart, but that doesn't mean people won't do it. They do it all the time. In fact, to me, it's always a mystery that they don't do it every single time, because the logical inference for why didn't you get someone interested in you could easily be because you're a failure as a human being. And at some level, that's actually true. Now, it's true in a way that's not that helpful, right? Because it's just too catastrophic. But it isn't obvious at all how people can defend themselves against that cascade of catastrophizing. I mean, after all, if you were everything you could be, then maybe everyone would be attracted to you. I mean, perhaps not, but you get the point. And no easy rationalization is going to let you just brush that away, especially if you actually happen to be interested in the person, because that's even worse, because then not only are you rejected, but you're rejected by someone upon whom you've projected an ideal, or perhaps from whom you've actually observed an ideal. So it's worse. You're rejected by someone that you want to be attracted to you, to validate your own miserable existence. It's not a trivial problem.